All right, looks like we're right at noon, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Patrick Lopez. I'm the Associate Director of Career Services at the Law School and one of the key people involved with the Lafer Border Justice Initiative. We're very excited to be doing this CLE series and to have all of you with us. It seems to be picking up momentum. We're getting more people every week, which is excellent. And again, welcome for all of you, and we're so glad to have you. And we're hoping to create a nice community, a group of people that can come together, discuss these issues, and get connected. So I'm going to cover a few housekeeping items first of all. Just want to let all of you know that this session is being recorded. So just be aware of that. I'll give you information for those of you who would like to get CLE credit. If you are in New Mexico, you should have received a form that you need to fill out, and then send that form to Sue George. The instructions are on that form, but her email is sgeorge2@unm.edu. For those of you who are out of state, you would send that form you'd send a request to Sue George for a certificate of attendance, which you would then submit to your state bar. So we can provide you that certificate of attendance, but you'd have to submit that to the bar yourself if you are not a New Mexico attorney. If you have any further questions about that, you can email me as well. My email address is lopezp@law.unm.edu, and I will put my email in the chat as well. So if you need to get that later, if you need to contact me for other things. If you're interested in volunteering or knowing more, or you want to know more about the Border Justice Initiative, I will have my email address there, and you can contact me that way. Okay, so regarding questions during the CLE, we're going to ask that you put your questions in the chat. I will be monitoring the chat along with some of the faculty that are working with us. And we'll interrupt if we think it's a good question or a relevant question. Otherwise, at the end of the presentation, we'll try to get the rest of the questions in the chat answered at the end. But if you have a question, please use the chat to submit your questions. Also, we're going to ask if you can make sure that your display name has your first and last name, your full name. We're trying to avoid being Zoom bombed or anything like that, just for security purposes. We ask that you have your username be your actual name. All right, and with that, I will go ahead and turn the time over to Taylor Levy, who is our excellent speaker today. And she volunteered to do her own introduction, which is great for me. Again, I'll put my email in the chat if you have any questions. But other than that, I will turn it over to Taylor.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Patrick. And thank you to the law school, and thanks so much for everyone for being on the webinar. I am very excited to do this. I get distracted sometimes when I'm talking on Zoom calls because I'm like, I wish I could hear you all reacting or hopefully laughing at my dumb jokes, but it's not doing that. So I will try and focus. I did tell Patrick I'm very happy to be interrupted about questions that are on topic, but if it's something that's going to be like slightly off topic, then I don't want to get distracted by it, and then we'll do it at the end. So I'll shoot for talking for like 30-40 minutes and with on-topic questions, and then at the end, happy to answer whatever. So as Patrick was saying, I wanted to do my own introduction because it's a bit strange. I think my trajectory to being where I am now. So my name's Taylor Levy. I'm an attorney in El Paso, Texas, and I do a lot of work in Ciudad Juarez as well. I have only been licensed for a little over a year, which is interesting, but I used to have an alternate legal license, which is called Department of Justice Accreditation, which allows you to practice immigration law only. So I've been practicing immigration law since 2014, and then while I was working full-time, I went to online law school at Mitchell Hamlin School of Law in Minneapolis, or in St. Paul. And they're going to get mad if they were on this call and heard me say that because they don't like each other, the two cities sometimes. But anyway, so that's how I became a lawyer at the same time while I was practicing immigration law, and why hopefully I am eligible to do the CLE with only a year of licensure under my belt. But I was working for a long time with Annunciation House, which is a migrant shelter in El Paso, Texas, that has received hundreds of thousands of migrants over the years. I worked with them for about a decade, from August 2009 until last year. And we worked extensively on family separation during the height of all of that. And then just everything basically you can imagine. For example, like when Jacqueline died, the little girl from Guatemala, we received his father. I represented him. That case was just in the news again on Wednesday because there was, congressional hearings about the fact they didn't do enough to keep her alive. And just lots of trauma, basically, all of that hard work. And then what happened, what I want to talk about a little bit for background for those of y'all who aren't immigration lawyers, is in March 2019, they changed the policies pretty drastically and created something called the Migrant Protection Protocols, which is a very kind of Orwellian name for what essentially amounts to what we call remain in Mexico, which is where someone who comes and seeks asylum in the United States is instead told, you need to come back for a court date on X date, and you need to go to Mexico. So when that happened, my work with Annunciation House kind of shifted a little bit, but started to make less and less sense because I was so interested in doing the work in Mexico, working with these people who are just kind of getting thrown on the streets in Mexico and had no options. But what they needed was they needed an American attorney to work with them for their US case, right? And for their US immigration case. So I started doing a little bit more and more of that work. And then it kind of like, in a very nice way, but it just kind of hit a head from like, well, that's not my real job, right? My job was to work in El Paso. And I kept running around Juarez like a crazy person, running around shelters and like doing street lawyering and all of this stuff. And so it just made more sense for me to step away from Annunciation House. And I kind of took a leap of faith and said, I want to do this work. I'm going to see if I can make it work and try and do it without ever charging migrants. And so luckily that has worked for the last year. I'm supported by private donations from individuals and also from organizational support from churches, from nonprofits, from foundations who decide to support my work in terms of materials I need to buy, but also in terms of like lending me office space and actually like paying my bills as well. So I've been doing that for about a year now. And so I just wanted to give that background because it's kind of weird what I'm doing, and I don't have a firm and I don't have a nonprofit specifically. What I do is a lot of like linkage work with different nonprofits and different private attorneys. And I focus very rarely do I take on my own cases. Instead, I do a lot of things in Juarez that other attorneys need help with, like actually taking people to the bridge once the other attorneys have figured it out, how that if they're going to get special permission to come in. I do the actual physical driving and walking across the bridge, and lots of work in Juarez. And so since the COVID pandemic or whatever, in mid-March, I actually moved to Juarez for about a month or so, just in case we were scared that the border was going to close, but then the border has not closed. So I lived in Juarez for about a month and then decided to come back to El Paso because the border has completely closed for asylum seekers, but what has not happened is it is not closed for US citizens or residents. And I think that that's kind of a good point of view to think about, kind of as you hear about me talking about everything, which is that lots of times I think you can hear like the border's closed, especially people more up north. I think most of y'all are Texas or New Mexico, but the border's not closed in that sense. I cross every single day or at least every weekday. I just waited in line for about an hour and a half this morning to come back because that many people were crossing. Citizens and lawful permanent residents can cross with no restrictions whatsoever. Occasionally, Mexican officials bring up that you need to be essential. It's never happened to me once since March. They've never said a word to me about that. Plus, I would be essential as an attorney, most likely. I know Sonora recently in Arizona said that they wouldn't let people come as tourists, but in terms of like the actual enforcement of it, I mean, the state having power to enforce that versus the feds is very kind of limited. So everything that the Trump administration has been doing to preclude all asylum seekers from being able to exercise their right to seek asylum in the United States is all under the auspices of the pandemic. You know, pandemic as pretext is how Human Rights First recently phrased it. And I think that that's very, very accurate. When I cross the border every single day, no one's taking my temperature. No one's asking me about symptoms. No one's telling me to quarantine. And I'm somebody who spends hours and hours on the streets talking to hundreds of people every day. I go to shelters with known positive COVID cases. I speak to people who aren't wearing masks. I speak to people who are coughing. I'm very high risk in terms of being like a frontline worker. And yet nothing happens when I cross the border whatsoever. We see Customs and Border Patrol agents, Border Protection agents on the bridge, lots of times not wearing masks themselves. And I also, obviously, I live in Texas, and as y'all know, New Mexico does things pretty different, but I can go to bars here. I don't do any of that, but I could go to bars. I could go to restaurants. I think I legally could go to movie theaters. I don't think the movie theaters in El Paso are open, but I could go to the gym. So I could do basically everything, but asylum seekers can't go to court, even if they've been waiting a year and a half for their court date. And new asylum seekers are completely barred. And this includes unaccompanied children. This includes small children. I can't talk about the details, but one of the cases I'm working on right now involves 2 5-year-old girls who are asylum seekers and who have been pretty much completely foreclosed by the new policies. So that's kind of like the background of like what things feel like, and why, to be perfectly honest, it feels super, super hard and frustrating right now. Sometimes, I say this a lot when I give these types of talks, is a lot of us, I think, felt like back in 2014 was when family detention first kind of started, and that was under Obama, that wasn't under Trump. And family detention at the time felt like the worst thing we could ever imagine, because, how are you putting babies and breastfeeding babies and, small children and teenagers, how are you putting them in jail? How could this possibly be happening? And family detention is parents with their small children. And at the time, it felt like the worst thing that we could imagine. I was going up to Artesia, which is in New Mexico, for about 6 months, going up 3 days a week to work with the legal team there. And now family detention still exists. And now, honestly, everyone I work with would beg for family detention over being trapped in Mexico, where they're constantly victimized and subject to just extreme amounts of violence and threats and kidnappings and rape. And yet family detention continues to be horrific. It's been in the news a lot right now, which I can touch on briefly later if I have more time, if people have questions about why it's been in the news so much. But so we kind of thought that was worse. And then the next thing that happened is we thought family separation was basically the worst thing that could ever happen. And it still is. And that was a terrible time. And I can't believe that our country decided that that was something that was okay, and this was an all right way to treat people, or there was any legal justification for this. Just so if y'all don't know, the legal justification for, separating people were that people, migrants had entered the country illegally because they crossed the border without being at a port of entry. For one, we would argue that's not illegal, because it's always legal to seek asylum under both our laws and international laws. But okay, fine, let's say it's illegal. It's a misdemeanor. It's a federal misdemeanor. It's the same federal misdemeanor as impersonating a 4-H officer. So like a 4-H member, not even an officer. So 4-H is like the agricultural department thing, right? Where you raise goats and stuff. So if I pretended that I had been a 4-H member when I don't raise goats, it's the same degree of misdemeanor. So it's like nothing, right? But that way we're going to, steal your child from you. So family separation, we thought, okay, once again, worst thing ever. And then MPP happened. And MPP is the migrant protection protocols. Like I'm saying, that's when people are, instead of being processed into the United States and put into detention centers or given GPS ankle monitors and allowed to enter the United States. There's a lot of people living in Albuquerque who entered during those years and are now, waiting for their court cases still. Instead, you're sent to Mexico and you're told you have to come back for a court date. So that has been happening since March 2019 in El Paso. Roughly 19,000 people were sent back in El Paso alone, and over 60,000 people across the border were sent back under the migrant protection protocols. And they were told basically to come back in 3 months for a court date. That was the average, but several people weren't given a court date until 11 months out. And you don't have one court. So it's very much, for those of y'all who aren't immigration practitioners, if you are immigration, it's master calendar hearings before your final court. But it's basically like a preliminary hearing in a civil matter or criminal matter, like an arraignment. And then you just have various hearings, right, before you get to the trial. So that means most MPP procedures are going to take between, the shortest it's going to be 2 courts, but most are going to take about 3 to 4 courts. And each one of those courts is going to be about 3 to 6 months away from each other. So this is a very, very long process of people being stuck in Mexico. And then the chances of winning is incredibly low as well. In El Paso in particular, it's a 95% chance that you're going to lose your case. Elsewhere on the border in San Diego and Matamoros, it's a bit higher. But MPP, at least kind of there's hope, right? So people are they're actually in court proceedings. They have a lot of legal rights, theoretically. You don't have the right to an attorney provided by the government because it's considered civil proceedings. So you have the right to an attorney, but you have to pay for it or have a nonprofit. Here in El Paso, the representation rate still is 0.5%. And that includes both free attorneys and paid attorneys. One aspect of migrant protection protocols that existed is something that's called a non-refoulement interview, which is like a word that people don't use that much, but also called a fear in Mexico interview. So you can technically request this interview, and if you prove that you are facing danger and persecution on account of a protected ground in Mexico, then you can get taken out of migrant protection protocols. The government says that those interviews are granted 13% of the time. That was their most recent survey on it, but it was a while ago. It was like 9 months or a year, I think. But in practice, we feel like it's much lower. And what's happened because of COVID is those interviews have been canceled and everyone's court dates have been canceled. So I know that was a lot of background, but I just wanted to kind of make sure we knew what we were talking about, because I want to talk about both new asylum seekers and existing asylum seekers who are already in this court proceedings. So people in migrant protection protocols, courts have been canceled since March 23rd, and they get canceled in month-long increments. So it also gives people a lot of false hope, because there's folks who I met at the bridge in March, because, like, to reiterate again, in March I started going to Juarez every day. I lived in Juarez first. And what I actually do is I literally just go to the bridge at 4 a.m. and I stay there from about 4 a.m. to 9 a.m. because that's the times that people have to show up for their court dates. So I can talk to people and give legal advice for free, because they don't know that their courts have been canceled a lot of times. And even then, if they do know, nowadays most folks know, but honestly, every single week I meet somebody who shows up to the bridge and has no clue that their court has been canceled. So I tweeted this for anyone who looks at my Twitter. Like, it sounds like a social media plug, like I'm a teenager, but I tweeted a picture of a 9-year-old boy in a full suit who showed up for his canceled court date in a full suit, and they had a full suitcase, and the mom was all dressed up nice, and they thought like that was the day they were going to have their court, they were going to win asylum, the judge was going to listen to them, and they were going to have their chance. And I was the one to break the news and really kind of just make them incredibly depressed. And that's a lot of what I do. I joke around that my job right now is basically being a dream crusher. But the reason why I think it's so important is that folks get so much misinformation. They get lied to by coyotes. They get lied to by notarios, which, people are pretending to be lawyers but aren't. And honestly, sometimes they get some false hope from attorneys who maybe don't know what they're doing because they don't practice on the border, or maybe they're jerks. But because the courts have been canceled, and they're canceled month by month by month. For example, yesterday I spoke to a woman who just gave birth to a newborn little baby. Her child is now a Mexican citizen. She should not be in the migrant protection protocols because she has a Mexican child, and the Mexicans can't be in MPP because they're fleeing Mexico, right? So they would have to be allowed in the United States, but because of Title 42, there's nothing we can do for her. Her court was supposed to be on Tuesday because that's when it had already been rescheduled from March, and her court was just rescheduled for November 4th. So she has to now wait between now and November 4th before she can even go to court or have a chance to be like, hey, government, I shouldn't be in MPP. I have a Mexican baby. Not to mention, she would have been taken out of MPP had she gone to her court, had it not been canceled in March, because she would have been over 7 months pregnant. And generally speaking, if you're over 7 months pregnant, you also get taken out of MPP. But now instead, she doesn't have court till November. So almost everyone who was scheduled for next week, their courts were rescheduled for the end of October or the beginning of November. And all of this is because of the cancellation of the courts. So I'm going to talk about Title 42. I saw it pop up in the chat in just a sec. But technically, the cancellation of MPP courts is not Title 42. They're two different things. So MPP, they're like, everybody mixes them up because they're at the same time, and they were very similar timing, but technically they're different orders because it has to do with the order. Title 42, which I'm going to talk about in a second, comes from the CDC and from DHS, as opposed to it's the immigration courts, which is the Department of Justice, is migrant protection protocols. And so since it's been canceled since March, that also means that no one's allowed to ask for this non-refoulement interview, which is the interview where you say that you're afraid in Mexico. So theoretically speaking, you should still be allowed to ask for this interview because it's something that is in
You're
DHS
breaking up
regulations.
really badly.
For everyone, or no?
I can hear you clearly.
Okay.
It may be something with this person's audio. Is anyone else having issues with audio? Okay.
Okay.
I can
Cool.
hear perfectly.
We did have
Okay, so I'm going to keep going.
We did have a couple of chat questions. There was the Title 42 one. And
Okay.
then another one, this actually was a good question too. Why the woman can't be an MPP because she has a Mexican-born baby?
Yeah, so I did gloss over that one. So MPP, Migrant Protection Protocols, is only for people who are from Spanish-speaking countries, which, yes, is a really weird thing to say because there's lots of languages spoken in every country, but Spanish-speaking countries and Brazil, and Mexico is excluded because it's allegedly Mexico is a safe place, not a safe third country, that's different, that gets mixed up too, but Mexico is a safe place for Guatemalans, Hondurans, Salvadorans, Cubans, Venezuelans, Brazilians to wait for their court hearing. But if you were Mexican and you're fleeing violence in Mexico, that wouldn't be a safe place for you to flee. So this little baby now is a Mexican citizen, and so he's going to be fleeing Mexico, so he couldn't be in migrant protection protocols. But these non-refoulement interviews, it for people is so much hope of like one of the only ways to get out of MPP and have hope. And since courts have been canceled since March, virtually in every single case, it's been denied. People haven't been able to have these non-refoulement interviews. They don't have the opportunity to tell CBP, look, you know, I'm fleeing extreme violence. And over and over and over again, we've seen just like horrific cases. I recently worked with some Cubans who were kidnapped by Mexican police officers and raped. Worked yesterday, got a text message from another Cuban who is being extorted currently by federal Mexican police officers. I had a man, this is really gruesome, but I tweeted about it, but I had a man actually show up to the bridge for his canceled court date, so the same date, and he came to the bridge and he just begged me, how do I get the fear interview? How do I get the fear interview? He's with his wife and his son, and then he holds up his hand and he shows me this pinky finger has just been cut off because he was kidnapped and his family wasn't able to come up with the ransom fast enough. And so they tortured him, you know, on video while sending it to the family to request the ransom. And he had like a very fresh, bloody stump. Like it was, I mean, I guess it could have happened in like a saw accident and they're lying about it. But this man was shaking and crying and just like, please, please, please. And he went to the middle of the bridge, you know, it was the date of his court, and just begged for this fear interview, which should be able to happen. We have an obligation as a country under our laws, like real laws, right? Because like international law is real law, but like I grew up with Republican parents and like, oh, international law, I don't believe in the UN, right? But so like, fine, it's an obligation under international law, but it's an obligation under our laws. And the non-refoulement interviews in particular is what the government cites to in all of the lawsuits against MPP as like, look, MPP is not illegal because Mexico's great. I go to Playa, you know, I go to Cancun every summer. And I mean, they don't write that in their briefs, but these are the arguments from the immigration judges too. They're like, Mexico's fine. Go to Mexico City. If you don't like Juarez, if Juarez is too dangerous, or if Matamoros is too dangerous, you could go to DF, you could go to Mexico City, you could go to Cancun. And they're just, and if you're not, you can have this interview, and this interview is going to give you a chance. And if you can actually prove that you're fleeing violence in Mexico, then you're going to be okay. But they've completely ended those interviews because of COVID. Pretty much there's like a couple exceptions, but for all intents and purposes, virtually no one on the entire border has been able to have one of those interviews. So all of these examples I gave, kidnapping victims, state police violence, you know, city police violence, rape victims, rape survivors. We were working with some lesbians because queer people are targeted horribly in Juarez. We were working with 2 Black Garifuna families from Honduras because there's so much racism in Juarez. When they walk down the street, people yell at them, monkey, monkey, negrito. They rub their arms and try and like they dare each other. You know, kids will, but adults too, dare each other to like rub them. Plus, you know, they get constant kidnapping threats. All of these cases, we've had zero luck whatsoever to get people these non-refoulement interviews. So these are all folks who are already in court proceedings. So that's like why I said there's like kind of 2 groups. So these are people who are already in court proceedings They have been waiting, most of them have been waiting over a year. Many have been waiting a year and a half. We've placed pro bono attorneys on a lot of these cases. Like I said, it's still 0.5%. And some folks have paid for attorneys. So on top of it too, their attorneys have been prepping their cases, but now, you know, they've been held up for 5 months now, and they're getting rescheduled for November and October. So like the nonprofits here, for example, are also really scrambling for staffing reasons, because one of my cases, for example, where I'm helping Hayez, their pro bono, and I'm mentoring through Hayez and Vecina, his final asylum hearing. He's a Venezuelan with like a crazy strong case. Like the administration keeps saying Venezuela is terrorist, you know, he really strong case. His court case was supposed to be April 8th, and it got moved to December 8th. And so that means, like, for us, I mean, we have to replan how we're going to do the trial in December. He's incredibly depressed. He's separated from his family because he's here alone. He's also faces constant violence in Juarez, although he's doing a little bit better than women and kids do sometimes, or queer people, because he's like tall and strong and whatever. But it's made it really horrible. One other kind of lawyery, nerdy thing that I want to say about MPP, since this is a lawyer audience, not like a student audience mainly, is this whole concept of service, right? Of proper service. And you have to tell people about their new court hearing. The US government has like completely just abandoned the concept of service, and is literally the official announcements are you should check the online system to see when your court is, or you can call this 1-800 number. So once again, my Venezuelan dude, he's pretty okay. Like he used to be a cop, like whatever, he's good. But like most of the people, a lot of the folks who are in MPP are like indigenous Guatemalans and, you know, rural campo Hondurans, you know, people from rural areas. They don't know how to use the internet system. No one teaches them how to do it. The 1-800 number, you can't dial a 1-800 number from Mexico. So they finally, after like 6 months, they made like a Mexican number you can dial. But I've tried it lots of times on Mexican phones. It almost never works. So the website is helpful and it works better. But like, that's not proper service. Like, there's laws in our country. There's like federal law of like, this constitutes proper service, like in immigration law too. And like, one of them is not, you should check a website frequently to make sure you don't accidentally miss court. But once again, the administration has just completely taken this idea of like, we don't care, we're in a pandemic, we have to do this, which is just blatantly not true. There would be plenty of ways to continue to have the courts. There would be ways to be creative about, you know, Zoom courts potentially, but also just like social distancing type courts, taking people temperatures, maybe having a lot of courts get moved later, but so you'd have fewer people coming to the courts, but still at least letting people's individual trials go forward, even if the preliminary hearings you kept pushing, or having the preliminary hearings being done over video at like a designated location with social distancing. There's lots of options if they wanted to give people actual chances here, but they don't. And so that's all the MPP population. That's folks who have already been in this process. Most of them arrived to the border last year at least. Most of them have a year to a year and a half. Some folks are new. They still occasionally put new people in MPP, despite the next thing that I'm going to talk about, which is Title 42. Every once in a while, some random people still get put into MPP. I met a Cuban woman yesterday who crossed a month ago, and instead of being Title 42, which we're going to talk about, she was put into MPP. I don't know why. It just happens. It's discretion. So that's all the MPP questions. Any questions in the chat box specifically about MPP before I move on to Title 42? No. Cool. So I can come back to it, obviously, if I need to. So that's all like existing asylum seekers who, so you know, they're freaking out. I mean, think about it. If you were freaking out, your court's been canceled over and over and over again. You can't even get this interview. We run a pregnancy project with several different organizations. We have 45, I think, pregnant women now on our list, and now we have 4 newborns plus 40 something pregnant women. A lot of the pregnant women in particular, you know, are horrified. They can't get enough care. We started the project specifically because there was no way for migrant women to get care routinely for their pregnancies. And a lot of those people are very desperate, and they're deciding to pay coyotes and cross instead. For understandable reasons. You know, they're like, they bought into the system. And the most common thing that I hear from the title or the MPP folks is like, I'm stupid. Like, all of my friends just like crossed illegally. Why have I waited a year and a half? I want to do things the right way. I want my day in court. no soy mala, like I'm not a bad person, I'm not a bad person, but now they feel just like dumb and desperate. And I've seen so many more people cross in the last several months really dangerously because they're like, screw this, like this is all a joke, this is theater, this is por gusto, it's like for nothing. And I think that's been really hard. So that's MPP. Apart from MPP is the big Title 42 that I keep alluding to. Title 42 is the order that has essentially completely decimated the ability for anyone to seek asylum, new asylum seekers in the United States, if they're coming from the southern border, or technically, I think, from Canada as well. It is Title 42 of the Public Health Code. It's actually a law that was first put on the books in 1893 and then later was codified again in 1944. So it is an incredibly old law, I think like 127 years or something. It was pretty much, it wasn't substantively changed between 1893 and 1944. It's a public health law that says, that bars the introduction of persons or property that like has a disease, right? So it is a old, very, very old law that has never ever been used in this way. That the legislative history of the law is it was to ban transport companies. So it never has been used ever for any deportation reasons. It was only ever used to bar transportation companies, to fine transportation companies if they knowingly introduced people basically on ships, right, back in 1893, and then 1944 ships, still maybe airplanes. I don't know when airplanes were made, but focusing to introduce people who have communicable diseases. So one of the only times it was ever really invoked was 1929, when there was a meningitis outbreak in Europe. And when it was invoked then, once again, zero deportation power, nothing about this part of the code. It's in the health code. It's not in the Immigration and Nationality Act. It's never referenced in the Immigration and Nationality Act. It is talking about the introduction of persons. There's no discussion of deportations. There's no discussion of not allowing people in at ports of entry, at the bridges, nothing like that. It only has fines. And so I'm getting all of this information, legislative history and stuff from the ACLU lawsuit about Title 42 right now. So if anyone wants to look it up, it's super fascinating. It's called JBBC v. Wolf, and those are initials because it's for a minor child. So it's JBBC v. Wolf. And so if you Google that and like with ACLU, instead of giving you the real site, you'll get all the materials on it for free instead of having to look it up on Pacer. But my point is, it's like a crazy old law that has nothing to do with immigration. And the administration has taken the position that Title 42 and the CDC saying that coronavirus, COVID-19, is a threat, that Title 42 supplants and supersedes every single other law that we have for immigration, basically, literally, in terms of asylum seekers, that it supplants everything, and that at discretion, they can choose to let people in, but otherwise they don't have to, and that it also applies to unaccompanied minors. So we have a lot of laws that protect unaccompanied minors, the TVPRA, the Trafficking Victims Protection and Reauthorization Act. We have VAWA, we have the Flores settlement, which I'm sure people have heard about. We have a lot of things to protect unaccompanied minors, for example. And then we have like a lot of laws for asylum seekers exist. It's a thing that exists. You can seek asylum. Obviously, we routinely violate those things, but the administration's position is that Title 42, because we don't want the introduction of COVID-19 into the country, supersedes every single existing law regarding asylum seekers. So Title 42 has been implemented since March 20th, and that means no new people are allowed to seek asylum unless on their discretion they randomly choose. There is the possibility of requesting an interview that's kind of like a non-refoulement interview, but it's an even higher standard. If you specifically, sua sponte, so on your own, tell the Border Patrol agent, I'm afraid of being tortured, and you specifically use the word torture, not killed, not anything else. You have to use the word torture. Then you get an interview. I forgot the stats. CBS got the stats recently. I think like 40 people out of like tens of thousands of people have even gotten the interview since March 20th. And then like no one passes it. So what this means is that instead of deporting people, they created a new thing that they called expulsions, which is a new word that they just invented, where they rapidly expel people. It doesn't count as a deportation. The average time it takes for them to expel someone is 96 minutes. And they are not given any paperwork whatsoever. They're fingerprinted to like make sure they're not a criminal, I guess, quickly. And then in 96 minutes, they're just dumped back into Mexico. So technically, Mexico will only accept Mexicans under this, Honduran, El Salvador, and Guatemala. So remember before, MPP is any Spanish-speaking country plus Brazil. For whatever reason, Title 42 is only those countries. So Mexico, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. However, I've personally met people who were Title 42 who were Nicaraguan and Ecuadorian. So even though they say that. What this means is it means that people who go to the bridge and try and ask for asylum or try and get on the asylum waiting list, which is called metering, which I didn't talk about much, but they're like, okay, I want to wait my turn. Cool. I don't want to break the law. I just like, please, please, please look at all my proofs. They show up at the bridge. So I go to the bridge every morning. They show up with like folders and dirty and like little kids who are crying and nose running, and they're like, no, pero mira, look at all the people who were killed in my family. Look at this photo. Look at this newspaper story. I just want to seek asylum. I'm like, dude, you're not going to be able to seek asylum. You do it. You try. Go to the middle of the bridge. The agents are going to tell you to leave, but sale vale, like you try, right? And then they go, and then they get turned back, and they're sad and they're crying. And then also in that situation, lots of times they're scared of me because they don't know who I am, because I'm just like a random white girl who's hanging out on the street at the base of the bridge being like, I'll help you. So sometimes they accept my help, but a lot of times they're scared of me. But I try my best to give them information. And then if you decide, because you're desperate, right? You've gone to the bridge, you've tried to seek asylum, everyone's told you there's no asylum waiting list, there's nothing you can do, you can't seek asylum. We have people who are actively fleeing Mexican violence, and obviously people who came up from these Central American countries. They're like, okay, well, fine. I'm going to enter iwi instead, enter without inspection, enter irregularly or unlawfully. If they're caught by Border Patrol, they are then immediately, like I said, within 96 minutes was the average, within an hour or two, they are fingerprinted, and then they're just taken to the middle of the bridge and they're told to walk south. So the vast majority of these happen in the middle of the night, because obviously when people are trying to like sneak into our country or whatever, they're doing it at nighttime when it's dark out. And then Mexican immigration tends to only work 9 to 5. So they are taken to the middle of the bridge and they're just told to walk south, and then they kind of stumble out on the bridge on the southern side. So if they happen to be returned during the day, they might get interdicted by Mexican immigration, who right now, because of a Mexican injunction, can't actually deport people either or detain them. So then Mexican immigration is supposed to take them to shelters that are voluntary shelters. They're not detention centers. But like lots of times they don't, because they don't want to do the driving. But sometimes they do. There's some really good shelters in Juarez, and I work in those a lot as well. And then it just happens over and over again also. So a lot of folks right now, because of the desperation, because it's like this perverse incentive, because you're not being held for a long period of time and you're not being charged with this like stupid misdemeanor, and you're not being held in federal custody, criminal custody, or immigration custody, and you get deported so quickly, it's actually given rise to a lot of folks treating this as like, okay, I'm just going to keep trying until I make it. I've actually heard of coyotes who are offering like unlimited specials, kind of like a cellular plan. Like they're charging $3,500 for unlimited attempts until you make it. And then but really what this means is we see people taking more and more and more dangerous routes. So I've been doing this work for 11 years. Virtually never did we see small children trying to cross without getting caught. Because when people are seeking asylum, it's legal to seek asylum. So people cross the border, but they cross the border and turn themselves into immigration and ask for asylum. It was almost never that we had like families, even at the height of, oh my gosh, all these families are crossing. The families were crossing and turning themselves in. Like Jacqueline's family, they cross and turn themselves in. Almost everyone, that's the case. Sometimes we'll see single able-bodied men, young men who are crossing trying to not get caught, but families are turning themselves in and asking for help. And now what we're seeing small children, pregnant women, elderly women crossing in incredibly dangerous routes. And it's really, for those of you all who do this work, like there's lots of stats that since the 90s when the border wall kept going up, it pushed people into Arizona and deaths went way up, and into the desert in Arizona and Texas because people are crossing in more rural routes. But once again, that's usually single adults. Not that like it doesn't matter when single adults die, of course, But what we're seeing now for the first time ever is small children taking incredibly difficult and dangerous routes. I've seen like a 10-year-old boy come back where he had like all this like bloody like chest area from climbing over the fence. Last week we had a young woman fall off the fence and die, which was pretty rare here in the El Paso sector. They still haven't even identified what country she's from. And about a month ago, we had 7 people die in a high-speed chase with Border Patrol. A few of those were U.S. citizens, probably the smugglers, and a lot of them were Central Americans and Mexicans who were trying to enter. So we're seeing people take incredibly difficult routes. There was one of the women I worked with was an 8-month pregnant woman. Her news story just came out. She walked all night in the desert over a mountain. She made it in. She's 8 months pregnant and a little bit more. She's like huge pregnant. And she was caught and she begged them for medical help. Please help me. Just take me, let me see a doctor. No, there's no doctors here. Sorry, no. And then took her to the middle of the bridge at 4:56 in the morning and told her to walk south. And press happened to be there like super randomly because they were looking to see if they got to see any of these happen. And so they got the whole story, and I ended up working with her, and she's okay. I mean, she's alive, but just incredibly difficult. And what we see is so much desperation, like I'm saying, people taking much more difficult routes, in part because there's no hope. Like, it was hard enough before. It was already really bad. But at least there was like, okay, hope if I turn myself in and then I'm put into MPP, at least there's some hope for my court date. It was still awful, but there was hope. And now we're seeing people just getting more and more desperate, taking more and more dangerous roads. And then one other thing that's happening is every once in a while, we don't know why, some people who cross illegally, cross irregularly, and get caught, every once in a while, they don't get sent back to Mexico and they get put into ICE custody. So, or once in a blue moon, they maybe get let go with an ankle bracelet, but realistically not. So they get put into ICE custody. And the only explanation I have for that is probably that ICE needs to fill beds. They have like contractual obligations to fill a certain number of beds, and they're at super low capacity because of COVID, but they still need to keep themselves at like 30% capacity or so, because they would have to do layoffs if they went below that like CDC low capacity number. That's my only explanation for why they are putting people into ICE custody sometimes. But what that happens is when they hear about, because then everyone hears about it, right? Because like cousins, and they all talk, and they're like, oh, I know somebody who made it through. So then it just encourages more and more people. Because if 90% of folks or 95% of folks are going to be deported right away, but that very small amount of people were able to get through, then it gives people hope, and it kind of encourages people to keep trying and keep making these really dangerous decisions. So that is what Title 42 is. Yeah.
We have a few questions on the chat.
Perfect.
Take a look.
I think that's good. That's good on like my data dump of all the talking, because it's 12:40. So thanks, y'all.
So the first question is, what's the name of the interview in which the person has to show a fear of torture?
So they didn't even name it. Okay. A Title 42 CAT screening, I think, which is the Convention Against Torture, because we got one leaked to us, but not the whole interview, just the findings. And I think it was labeled Title 42 CAT screening, and CAT is Convention Against Torture screening.
Okay. Next question is, will those prosecuted for illegal re-entry still receive reasonable fear interviews once they are transferred to immigration upon completion of their criminal cases, or are they simply deported?
So most people are not being charged. We know it's not zero. Generally, most people aren't being charged, at least with illegal entry. So the illegal re-entries, what happens to them after? Mexicans, we're seeing them all get Title 42'd for the most part. So just like dumped back in Mexico the same day that they're taken out of marshal custody, so federal criminal custody. Some Cubans are ending up, in particular Cubans, are ending up in ICE custody. Some Cubans get put into MPP. And so it's not the countries that so like you're not allowed to Title 42 some countries. You can Title 42 them, but not to Mexico. You have to Title 42 them to their country. So that would be Cuba, Brazil, like the highest countries, Cuba, Brazil, Nicaragua, Ecuador. So all of those countries, since you can't just send them to Mexico unless you put them into MPP, instead sometimes they put them into Title 42, but in ICE custody while they're awaiting a plane. And that's what they do with children as well. So they put the children actually into motels, secret motels that we don't know where they are. We just hear from the kids later until they can get room on a plane. And so it just depends. If you have a client who's charged with illegal reentry, if they're Mexican, almost 100% Title 42. If they're, even when we've intervened as attorneys, I think I know of 4 cases where we've intervened and we still lost. And they were like, nope, sorry. Some cases with hope. And then if they're like Brazil, Ecuador, like a country where you have to get a plane, then they might end up in ICE custody. And they might get, every once in a while, like I said, they need ICE beds. They treat some people normal. Cuba won't accept anyone. And that's why it seems to be that Cubans are getting a chance to seek asylum sometimes in ICE, because they haven't accepted a plane since March.
Okay. A couple more questions. How can this information be disseminated publicly for communities to realize its impact? Are there any reports that are written for public consumption for references? And then the ICE capacity of 30%, is that for the contract agencies running these detention centers?
Okay, so the first question is, Patrick, y'all are gonna send out that one pager that I sent, right, with links?
Yeah, we'll send that
So the
out.
link, yeah, the link that I have on it, the best link I would say is Human Rights First, put out a really amazing report on all of this, which is called Pandemic as Pretext, which is basically, like, I think the perfect name for it, the same way I kind of give these talks. And so that explains a lot. I mean, we're constantly trying to get things in the news. It just doesn't, people just don't really care is what it feels like. So yes, please, explain this as much as possible. I would say realistically, something that we think we can hopefully win, like realistically with the current administration, is to at least get non-refoulement interviews started again. That would at least be a little bit of something. We're trying to do that. We're pushing really hard for that. And also at least for unaccompanied minors to be excluded from these policies. So, children who show up alone, most of them are like 15, 16. This morning, I spoke to a 17-year-old unaccompanied minor who crossed alone and was Title 42. So he wasn't given a chance to seek asylum at all. Those were the 2 questions, right? Or what was the ICE one. ICE one, I feel like I end up sounding like a crazy conspiracy theorist, but I literally have no other idea why some people are treated differently despite Title 42 other than that. The contract facilities, we right now, like, people talk about the congressional bed mandate, which is where we have to have 30,000 beds full at any time. That's not it. We have to be paying for 30,000 beds at any time. There have to be 30,000 ICE beds available at any time. Someone else might know the number. I think there's only like 15-ish thousand people in ICE custody right now, maybe a little more. So it's not that we have to have 30,000, it's that we have to have them available. So they're just sitting empty right now. I think, though, individual facilities and ICE feel like they will have to start laying off staff unless they keep those beds full to some extent. So ICE is generally telling us that they're keeping facilities around 30 to 40%, at least in El Paso. But people get out, people win their cases, people win bond, right? And then they need, that's what I think. I know it sounds crazy, but that's what a lot of us think on the border, is that they're trying to not have to do layoffs or something.
Okay. So a couple more questions, or unless you want to wait till the end or...
No, I'm done. Okay.
So this is one you and I were talking about this before the presentation, so it's a good one. How can attorneys who typically don't do this kind of work get involved? What can they do to help?
Yeah, I think for one, just like spreading the word, this is crazy. But HIAS in particular and Clinic are 2 big orgs who are looking for volunteers. If you're an attorney who's actively licensed, also Vecina is looking for people. So all 3 of those organizations. I can send out the links, but HIAS is like a big, huge national organization, but they're looking for people to fill out asylum applications for folks over the phone. It usually takes like 2 to 3 hours, but you need to speak Spanish. Clinic and HIAS probably also would help with like briefing and stuff. And then Vecina looks for someone who's willing to take on an entire case. That's what they place an entire case, and then they have mentors. Like, I'm one of the Vecina mentors, so I mentor people through a case. But if you feel like you can take a case from start to finish, which is also difficult, because like I said, my poor mentor, her case moved from April 8th to now it's December 8th. And she's also like older and retired, and I mean, it's COVID and a pandemic and who knows. So that Vecina is a really amazing option if you can give that much time, but to take on the full case. And then HIAS is HIAS, and Vecina is like neighbor in Spanish, so VECINA. So what else, Patrick?
There was another question. Are there safe shelters for persons who manage to cross into the U.S.?
If somebody crosses without getting caught,
I'm,
I assume?
I'm assuming that's what it was, yeah.
Yes, if somebody crosses without getting caught, Annunciation House still exists in El Paso, where I used to work, and it's amazing. And they have 1 million COVID protocols, and they will take positive cases from ICE if we ever get them released, and which is rare, but it happens normally with federal lawsuits called habeas. And yeah, I mean, they exist. They're pretty much empty. I mean, the shelters are all empty and everyone doesn't know what to do. It's real hard right now because most organizations do, not Annunciation House, but most organizations that send people to Mexico have had to make really hard decisions to stop going to Mexico in person, right? As most of y'all probably are working from home and thinking about like organizational liability and subtle pressure of like you're making your employees go to Mexico and be exposed, or the detention centers too. So most agencies are working from home right now also, but yes, there's still shelters.
And the next question is they're asking if they can contact you via email. I'll let you.
Yes.
Okay. What's your email address?
My email address is taylorlevylaw@gmail.com. So
Okay.
TAYLOR and then LEVY law@gmail.com. Oh, and I have a website now. I forgot. I do have a website.
Okay. Any other questions from anyone? We have a couple minutes left here. I think we've gotten to everyone's question.
It does look like there's another request from Jesse Miles in the chat saying we really need help from people who have experience with federal habeas corpus or writs of mandamus. You're welcome to contact us. We're gonna, Patrick will again send out his email address. We're gathering names of volunteers and trying to organize some sort of support structure so that we can be of assistance to the groups that are working and provide quality support for the people that want to volunteer as well. So we welcome you, of course, to reach out directly, but especially if you have any federal habeas corpus experience or writ experience, we would hope to be able to work with you to be able to provide more assistance.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'd second what Jesse said. Yes, the people in detention, I mean, Otero, New Mexico, if y'all don't know, it has like the 3rd or 4th highest outbreak in the country for, at least for an ICE facility, but I think actually including prisons as well. It is really high contagion rates and people continue to be transferred there. I was just talking to a lawyer yesterday who has a Cuban couple who e-weed and they were not sent back to Mexico, and who knows why. But one was put into El Paso, and then the husband was just transferred to Otero, which is in New Mexico, where there's all of this COVID. So we do really, really need people who, like, if you like briefing, because I do not like briefing, I like hanging out on the street and giving out candy to children. Yes, people who like briefing is incredibly helpful. I think that it's just a matter of the organizations like getting back to you about like, hey, we need help for people to do briefing and stuff. I guess I will, if there's not another question, because I'm like, I have 5 minutes. If I can, I will touch really briefly on why family separation's in the news, even though that's not technically a border topic, if that works. Is that cool, Pat?
Works for me, yeah.
Okay, so family separation 2.0 is in the news a lot right now because of family detention again. So like I was saying, family detention is where moms and dads, so not kids in cages. Like it's not like kids who are stolen from their parents and are in cages. It's like a family detention center. It's still horrible, but just to be clear, these are not stolen children. These are children with their parents, currently with their parents. And so the Flores settlement is a settlement from 1990, 30 something year old settlement that says that children get special treatment when they're in custody. And this was because of like horrific treatment, but it's a settlement and y'all are mostly lawyers. It's not like an injunction, it's a settlement. The US government said, we are gonna do X and Y and Z and blah, blah, blah to take care of children. So the Flores settlement for a long time until a couple years ago did not apply to family detention. But then the judge who's in charge of monitoring the Flores settlement said it did and also apply to family detention. That judge is Dolly G. So Judge G, she has she only has jurisdiction theoretically over the children because she is the, no, I'm like, y'all are law professors. I'm like so used to saying this to like students and community members, but like, anyway, she's enforcing a settlement for children, right? And so she recently said that the family detention centers are on fire. That's in her order, that they're on fire because of how much rampant COVID is. The order is incredibly strong. There's many families who have tested positive for COVID. The average age of these kids is like under 10, 18-month-olds, 6-month-olds, breastfeeding babies, 2-year-olds. The longest any of these families have been in family detention is, I think, 318 days was the most recent. And they're in these family detention facilities. They are getting COVID. They are facing possible death. And Dolly G said, you have to remove all, or free all of the children by today, right? Today is July 17th. And then on Wednesday, the government, both sides, whatever, it was annoying, but they stipulated to extend that deadline to July 27th now. But what the government is doing to enforce that order to free all the children is they are going to give a voluntary choice, right? Because it has to be knowing and voluntary, to all the parents who are currently in detention with their small children, terrified of COVID, many COVID positives, and tell them you can voluntarily either choose to waive your child's rights under the settlement, so to opt out of your settlement rights as a class member for your child, or you can choose to give your child away to a sponsor of your choosing. So you can either give your child away, or you can waive your child's rights to the settlement and stay detained. And so that's what we have been calling, it's called binary choice. That's what the government called it. They leaked it. Binary choice. I wrote an op-ed about it last year in the Wash Post, so it explains more. But it's just family separation 2.0. It's a Sophie's choice. It is a horrific choice to tell parents who are in the middle of a global pandemic, who are asylum seekers, who are fleeing horrific violence in their home countries. Your choices are to stay detained in this facility that is on fire because it's so horrific for contagion. It's a congregate setting, or you can give away your child with no knowledge if you're ever going to see that child again, what their immigration status is going to happen, anything else. It's not like your kid gets papers and you give them away. It's like you can give your child away to a sponsor of your choosing. They'll continue to be in deportation proceedings, and you will continue to be detained in an adult ICE facility that has even more COVID, and then get deported. So that is binary choice. That's why we're trying to blow up everything on Facebook and Twitter and everything else right now, and calling your representatives to tell ICE to free the families together. Because even though the judge can't order ICE to free the parents because she's enforcing a settlement about children, like ICE can free the families easy tomorrow. It's not a hard thing for them to do. Like they have 100% discretion to free everyone. There's no one ever that they have to detain. Even they talk about mandatory detention sometimes, but it's not actually a legal requirement. They always have the right to discretionarily choose to free people. So we're trying to get them to free the families together, and anything y'all can do in terms of talking to congressional reps, calling your representatives, calling ICE. Raices has been doing a big campaign on it. Families Belong Together, Aldea, myself, we're just like everything possible to try and get there's enough pressure so that these families get freed together instead of being put in this position to give away their child to save their lives. So.
All righty. Well, we do have some people in the chat. Thank you for reaching out from Universidad de La Salle de Mexico City and University of Denver. So excellent. These are the connections that we're trying to make with this. So we do want to stay in touch with all of you guys because, this is important work that we're going. So any last minute questions? We got a couple of minutes. Otherwise, I think we can end here, right?
Yeah.
Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. And again, we're so excited. This is growing every week. And yeah, join us next week for more. And thank you so much, Taylor, for your excellent presentation today. And we will see all of you soon. So thank you.
Thank you all so much. Thank you so much for having me.